seconds. Okay, so to begin the session, I know that people will continue to trickle in, and that's totally fine. But we'd like to start, of course, with prayer to our God to ask him to bless this time together. So we've invited Jacob, who's the seminarian for the Diocese of San Diego, who's helping out here in the Office for Evangelization and Catechetical Ministry, to begin us in prayer, please, Jacob.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for our life, and we thank you for our bodies and everything that comes with it. We ask that you continue to bless us and encourage us to share the truth of our faith, especially the difficult truths, such as sexuality and those revolving our bodies with others, and empower us to do it in a loving way. In this we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Jacob. Okay, we'd like to, today's presentation will be done by Ascension Press, and we have the representative today with us, Colin McIver. He is a staff writer for Ascension Press. He's also the co-author of this curriculum that we'll be talking about today. So Colin, we hand you the floor, and we'd like, please introduce yourself, a little more about you, and then jump right in to what beautiful resources Ascension has to offer us. For everyone, you are welcome. Please put any questions you have in the chat box, and then Colin will address those towards the end of his presentation. Okay, so thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you. And I want to thank you for the invitation to be here to talk to you about the theology of the body. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. And in the midst of the pandemic, I guess I haven't had quite as many opportunities to make a presentation like this. So this is a great privilege to be with you today. I am in my classroom at St. Scholastica Academy in Covington, Louisiana. We are in school, except today was a PSAT day. So some of our students came in the morning, and our 8th graders came and were inducted into our school community. And this afternoon, I have an empty classroom and a great opportunity to talk to you. And that's artwork from my kids behind me. I didn't even realize it was there, but I was like, oh yeah, I guess so. So I think the theology of the body, relevant for all ages. That's going to be one of my points today. So it's cool that I have some artwork from my kids behind me. I'll talk a little bit about the programs that this presentation will refer to. The first one is called the U program. It is the descendant of Theology of the Body for Teens, which is an older program that some of you may be familiar with. And a little bit of the backstory. So Brian Butler, who is a mentor and friend and co-author on these programs, was studying the theology of the body, and as a young youth minister, as somebody who had just founded a ministry called now Dumox Ministries, he just had the insight in studying theology that the audiences of theology of the body were actually very relevant for young people, but that the audiences themselves are written in a way that probably most young people wouldn't pick up and find as a page turner. But the more he studied about the life of St. John Paul II, the more it became clear that the insights of theology of the body are critical for the human formation of young people. And so Theology of the Body for Teens was born. It was a program that U is derived from, that contains videos and activities and stories and all kinds of ways to make the teaching of the theology of the body relevant and accessible for the modern teenager. And so that program is really written for 9th through 12th grade. It's available, and one of the most important elements of it these days is the parent guide. And that's always been the truth, but especially during COVID. One of the things I want to talk about today is how we can equip people in their homes to run this study, that those of us involved in parish ministry or in school ministry can give a confidence boost to parents who right now find themselves spending a lot more time with their teenager than they used to, or at least with the teenager in the house, hopefully not in a room with the door closed, hooked up to a screen. The other program is Theology of the Body for Teens Middle School Edition. And after Theology of the Body for Teens was written, one of the most overwhelming responses we got was, this needs to go earlier, this needs to go earlier, because our middle schoolers, and this was a few years back now, our middle schoolers are already asking these questions and already need a foundation. And so while the Theology of the Body for Teens Middle School edition is a little bit of an older program, I still think it's quite relevant. And I still think the approach of beginning a systematic formation in theology of the body earlier than freshman year is really important. So the target for this curriculum is 6th through 8th grade. And our idea was that really to build up to the theology of the body, there's this kind of scaffolding that we have to do. There are just principles of what it means to be human, of identity and mission that can be built on without compromising the innocence of a 6th grader, but also while equipping that 6th grader for the world that they're surrounded by now. And even internally for the changes that are occurring in their bodies and the questions that they naturally have. So those are the programs that this is derived from. And I'm going to actually draw from the slide deck that I used to do before the pandemic, when we would kind of travel around and give formation presentations on theology of the body. And the flow of the next several minutes is going to be to talk a little bit about youth culture, to talk about middle schoolers and teenagers, and then to talk about the theology of the body itself, and then to talk a bit about the resources that we have. And then once we do that, we'll open the floor for whatever your questions are. So teens and middle schoolers are suffering from an identity crisis. One may say that, well, the entire world is suffering from an identity crisis. And I would say it is the problem that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, that we all suffer from this chronic amnesia, that we were created as sons and daughters of God, and yet discovering what that means is really the process of human life. And maybe it's in some ways most potent when you are 11, 12, 13, 14, all the way through 18 years old, trying to figure out really who you are. And throw into the mix, even though this is a problem that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and traces itself throughout salvation history, you throw social media into the mix, and the identity crisis is particularly potent and powerful. And I think a lot of our young people are just trying to figure out who they are, where they draw their identity. Especially since the pandemic began, a lot of, let's say that you have a very well-involved teenager who plays sports and is on the student council and does, this or that or the other thing. All of that was sort of taken away. And a lot of the places that our young people, even in healthy ways, tried to find a sense of self, those are disrupted. And so a lot of our young people right now could really use a dose of the core and powerful message of where we find our identity. They're ferociously seeking fulfillment, authenticity, seeking acceptance. That's from middle school all the way through high school, maybe to now, because all of us are recovering middle schoolers and teenagers, and some of us still carry around some of the same issues that we carried around when we were in middle school and high school, whether we like to talk about that or not. And many of these same young people, though, they bring hope. Many teens who are coming alive in their faith, and even in the midst of the pandemic. Some of you probably run youth groups that have gone virtual, or you're getting back together in person with your youth group, and you're maybe finding some inspiring things. During the pandemic, there are kids who never came to my youth group who are coming to do praise and worship on Instagram every Monday. There were messages that we were getting from young people who are looking, well, how do I grow in my faith in the middle of all of this? And so there is that hope. Or just last week, we beatified the church beatified Blessed Carlo Acutis. And if you hadn't heard of Carlo Acutis, he could be the patron saint of what we're talking about today. He died at the age 15 of leukemia. He said rather famously that we were born to be originals. We were born as originals, yet many die as mere photocopies. That strong message of identity. And Carlo Acutis was somebody who sought to root himself in the Eucharist, in reconciliation, in a devotion to Our Lady, and in just loving God and loving neighbor, and did so in a very simple and yet challenging way. And so there's a lot of hope in youth ministry, and a lot of challenge at the same time. I'm sure for all of us, there are, whether sessions in person or Zoom sessions, where you leave encouraged, and then there are other times where we have conversations where we realize how heavy the burden is on our young people. And both things are true. Two things can be true. your own experience of today's teen. And maybe we could even put this in the chat. I'm not sure because I have this screen open, but even if you want to put into the chat to each other, if you were to describe today's teen in one word, what word would you use? And you can go ahead and just kind of put that in the chat. One word to describe your experience of today's teen. What would you use? Go ahead. I'm going to see if in my view I can see your answers too. I'm going to stop sharing for a second so I can take a look. I don't think I have the chat. Oh, here we go. All right, so some of the words that are coming up. Let's see. We got fabulous, curious, anxious, a lack of rootedness, awkward, anxiety. Yeah, there we go. They're confused, challenging. Yes, doubtful. Yeah. So yeah, I think a lot of these words. I like that we started the first response was fabulous, because that is true, and in the deepest sense they are fearfully, wonderfully made. But yeah, all those other things exist, and they're a giant sort of web of potentiality, our young people. And let me get back into my PowerPoint here so we can sort of see. At the core, I think middle schoolers, teens, the rest of us, we crave the adventure of self-gift over the glut of self-indulgence. One of the most quoted lines from the Second Vatican Council in the life of St. John Paul II comes to us from the document Gaudium et Spes. We could paraphrase it to say that we weren't made for self-assertion, but for self-gift. The meaning of life is not found in asserting ourselves on the world, but found in making a gift of ourselves. And the fabulousness of our teens is found when they're freely able to be and express and give themselves. And the anxiety of our teens, it happens when they and we are turned in on ourselves, and when we suffer from that amnesia, when we grab and we grasp at identity, or we grab and we grasp at something to make ourselves feel better in the midst of our anxiety, our stress, our precarious situation in the world. And yet the truth is that we find in the adventure of self-gift our truest and greatest fulfillment. And yet, I sort of iconically, and this is an old slide and I kept it in here because it's still true, we could just sort of look at the way we are in such a world of consumption. You know, Pope Francis talks about throwaway culture, and that throwaway culture is really just rooted in consumption, not only of things and images, but unfortunately consumption of people. And you see the young man who's kind of pictured here, and like Netflix is just figured out how to keep him wired in. All the tech companies are just competing for attention, and he's also got another screen open, and there are algorithms that have figured out what'll keep this kid involved so that he keeps buying more Coke and more nachos, and his phone's also open. And that's not all of the time, but I'll tell you, this is a pre-COVID slide, and I was sharing even before we got on the call, one of my biggest concerns with teens these days is with a lot of things being shut down. If they're in their homes, and if there isn't a vibrant family culture, how many teens are sucked deeper and deeper into the web of just digital consumption that may temporarily spike dopamine levels, but that ultimately leaves them empty and vulnerable. And to be frank here, I think we see in this image, there's Netflix and there's screens open, but there is the devil is prowling like a roaring lion, seeking for someone to devour. And one of the greatest weapons of evil in this world right now is pornography, where you have a lot of our young people whose entire sense of self and worth and sexuality has been turned in on itself in a way that is so toxic and heartbreaking. And it warrants a response from us and from their parents. So I hate to begin a presentation with like a lead balloon, but I want to talk about what some of these challenges are. And I promise I have good news. There's a lot of good news, but we do have to acknowledge what some of the problems are. So these are statistics that came off of, I think associated with Covenant Eyes that I pulled these just a few years back. But 9 out of 10 boys are exposed to pornography before the age of 18. That's almost everyone. 6 out of 10 exposed before the age of 18 in terms of girls. As the campus minister in all-girls school, I wonder if that isn't a little bit higher as pornography finds new ways to target and entice young people, boys and girls alike. The first exposure to pornography among men is about 12 years old on average. And not to sound like a pessimist, but I would not be shocked if the next time a study comes out, if that age is not moved down to 11 or even 10 years old. And anecdotally, I can tell you that simple things that parents unwittingly expose their kids to on their devices can open a web of pornography. 71% of teens hide online behavior from their parents. 83% of boys, 57% of girls have seen group sex online. And there is just a lot of terrible content that is out there. I think it's important to talk about same-sex attraction, gender identity, to talk about the experience of young people who are experiencing an attraction to people of the same sex, and also who are experiencing some level of dysmorphia in terms of their own bodies. Those who would identify with the LGBTQ community and wonder what their place is in the church. And I can say, just kind of as a close to home, without disclosing anything too personal, just in my own kind of web of ministry, a close collaborator in ministry was sharing with me the experience of a young woman who since she's 18 and has been experiencing attraction to other girls for 4 or 5 years, finally just told her parents, and just kind of how that whole experience has been for her. And even though she's heard from a lot of people in the church, hopefully, that she's loved by God, that there's a place for her, she really had not been able to receive that message. She still just sort of felt just alienated and isolated. And so there's a lot of work for us to do in this area. So issues of same-sex attraction, gender identity, they've dominated cultural conversation. They've broken open a necessary conversation about sex, identity, marriage, family, meaning and fulfillment in an unprecedented way, about the place that a young man who's attracted to other young men and experiences his sexuality that way, who's looking for, well, how can I live out my calling faithfully? What does chastity look like for me? And again, I think that there's good news in the theology of the body about the inherent and inalienable viability of every young person created in the image and likeness of God, and hopefully some help for parents who are trying to navigate as well. Let's say they're I call it old-fashioned fornication. So hopefully this side doesn't come across as flip, but when we first came out with Theology of the Body for Teens, I think the way a lot of people approached this was, well, this is the slightly John Paul II-ized version of the abstinence talk that we used to have with kids at youth group in the 1990s, right? That the goal before was we want to make sure that young people don't have sex before marriage. And in 2020, we still hope that our young people refrain from having sex until they're married. That's still very much a goal. But I think what's become obvious to me, and probably to a lot of us on the call, is that our goal for the sexual and human formation of our young people isn't just that they avoid having sex until they're married, right? It still is something that's kind of out there, that in between 2011 2013, so this is pretty old, right? You had 44% of female teenagers and 47% of male teenagers aged 15 to 19 who said that they'd had sexual intercourse. And the percentage declined significantly by 14% for females and 22% in male teenagers over the last 25 years. So that's just going up to 2011 to 2013. I have a question about that statistic, even in 2013, though, because I kind of think that number would be even lower now in terms of percentage that would report having actual sexual intercourse. But I think our frontier has shifted to wanting to ensure that young people don't become addicted to pornography, don't find themselves engaging in interpersonal pornography across screens. The young people aren't having other forms of sexual activity and saying, well, technically this is an intercourse, and so technically I'm a virgin, because the church's interest here is in preserving the integrity of our young people, is in equipping them to make a free and total and faithful and fruitful gift in marriage. And just simply the fact of waiting till you're married isn't enough. I remember, and maybe some of you do as well, going to youth group. I was 13. I had a really powerful experience at a youth conference, and I got a chastity card, and I kept the chastity card in my wallet, and it was a promise to save myself until marriage. And while I think that there is something laudable there, I will readily admit, and one of the reasons that I got into developing resources for this sort of thing is that wasn't enough. What I needed as a teenager was formation on, well, why wait? It isn't an arbitrary rule that God gives us. We are wanting our young people to be equipped in making a self-gift, to understand the goodness of human sexuality. And unfortunately, in a polarized world of rubber bands, teens either hear sex is bad and dirty and wait until you're married. It's sex is dirty, it's bad, and save it for someone you really love later. Or they hear the opposite message, which is to say, because sexuality is good, it's no big deal, and try to find gratifying experiences in any way that you can. And like all good Catholic teaching, theology of the body is not either of those extremes. It is to affirm the goodness of the body and the goodness of human sexuality. And it is also to affirm that because it is good, it belongs in a particular context, because it makes a particular commitment and promise and brings life into the world. And y'all, as we go further and further into our culture, that message is so needed. And when it's received, it can be so liberating from the emptiness that is out there. Emotionally, we could say that there is a risk, and girls who are sexually active are more than 3 times as likely to be depressed as girls who are abstinent. Suicide attempt rates for sexually active girls were 6 times higher than the rates for virgins, and sexually active boys more than twice as likely to struggle with depression. Again, these are older statistics. I don't know if any of you have seen recently The Social Dilemma on Netflix. I was sort of referring to it a little bit earlier. But the statistics in terms of teen suicide have jumped exponentially since smartphones have become a thing in our pockets. And I wonder what's also tied in there. So there is this problem with explicit sexual activity, but also this problem with identity, with the way in which we unfortunately sometimes are marketing ourselves to the world. And a lot of it leads to human misery and leads to our teens being in a dark place. And I don't think that those two things are unrelated. I think that ultimately, I call them Genesis 3 problems. The Genesis 3 problems are when we turn in on ourselves, and our teens, unfortunately, are in a world that is trying to get them to turn in on themselves. Research shows that adolescent sexuality, premarital sex, is associated with marital dissolution, so that later on, young people are less likely to enter into marriages where they can freely, totally, faithfully, and fruitfully commit. Adolescent sexual debut is not completely wanted, and is both directly and indirectly linked to marital dissolution. So the problem of what we could call rape culture, which is a real thing, for our faculty development, the professional development that I'm missing right now, I was just reading in a book that was talking about the experience of young women, and talking about there's the issue of consent, but there's also the rather prevalent problem of teenage girls who find themselves in situations where they don't explicitly say no to a sexual encounter, but they're not really looking for it either. And the way that a lot of girls and probably boys in some ways too are just swept along into sexual activity because it's the expectation. And this is toxic later on in terms of trust and in terms of sex being what it ought to be in the context of marriage. So that's out there too. Physically, you still have the age-old problem, the 90s the 1990s abstinence talk, which I remember in high school seeing slides of different STDs, and sort of kind of the message was, wait till you're married or you're going to get this or this or this. And but it is still true that there is a medical reason as well, and we don't want to ignore that. I will say our resources aren't heavily focused. There are certainly no pictures of the effects of STDs in our pages. Vocationally, and the not so secret, not so evil plan of the theology of the body in terms of formation is that it's supposed to prepare us for vocation. And when a man gets married as a virgin, his divorce rate is lower. For girls, it's 76% lower. And what we don't have statistics on is, what does that look like in terms of pornographic exposure? Or what does that look like just in terms of the kinds of physical activity and the kinds of activity that young people enter into because they're poorly formed. So we can take a look at that as well. Spiritually, and we don't need stats for this, we just have scripture, the disintegration of body and soul, a compartmentalization of faith and life, where we split ourselves from who I am at youth group and who I am at the party, or who I am for my church friends and who I am when I'm with my other friends, or who I am in front of my parents and who I am in front of my friends when I'm trying to impress them. And that split is something that we really want to address, and it's something that these formation materials do address. And then, of course, you have St. Paul, who gets pretty hardcore in 1 Corinthians 6, and he talks about one of the things that can deprive us of the capacity to enter into the kingdom would be a lack of chastity. We think about the beatitude, blessed are the pure of heart, for this shall see God. Well, what follows if we're not pure of heart? We lose our ability to be able to see God. It's pretty dire. Back in 1995, there was a document called The Truth and Meaning of Human Sexuality, and it's an older document, but it's one of the many areas in our faith where we're reminded of the role of parents, of how the promise that they make when they receive that candle at baptism carries over into every area of the formation of young people. And I'm hoping in question and answer we can talk a lot about this, because I think it's really important, how to get parents involved. Parents must insist on the positive value of chastity, its capacity to generate true love for other persons. This is the most radical and morally important aspect of chastity. And check this out. Only a person who knows how to be chaste will know how to love in marriage or virginity. Only a person who knows how to be chaste will know how to love. So chastity is requisite for being able to love. And that may sound like kind of overblown, but when we say chastity, what we really mean is the ability. It's a virtue. It's an exercise of sort of the muscles of our humanity by pointing ourselves in a direction of love. This is why chastity could mean celibacy. But chastity also in marriage means expressing sexuality in a way that is self-giving, that is pure, that is free, that is self-controlled. And so chastity is so important. And unfortunately, we live in a world where rather than practicing or cultivating chastity, dating culture cultivates the opposite of chastity. And it's no wonder if you had a soccer team that had terrible practice habits and was practicing all the wrong things on the field, when they got into a game, you wouldn't expect them to win, right? And unfortunately, whereas teen culture and dating culture is supposed to be a training field of virtue, it's become a training field in self-indulgence. And for that reason, we see a lot of toxic relationships. And I think the good news I have is I think we can affect change in this area. I really do. In part by equipping parents to pass on a conviction. And so that's going to be one of the most important missions that we have. A little bit about just this generation. They're fast paced, like their parents. They think they're more mature than they are, and therefore you have drinking, smoking. Now it's vaping, partying. Vaping, I just don't get. I don't know. That they're lost, materialistic, longing for purpose, living digital lives, extreme, often hopeless, depressed. But there are all of these ways we could point to. I would think for many of us on the call with young people that we know who are spiritually beginning to balance emotion and substance, who are themselves like a Carlo Acutis, a sign of hope. We have this just very bodily generation, And again, all of this made before COVID, that I can even think of, since then, some ways that this has kind of evolved, that the bodily generation now is so into digitally projecting themselves. If you hang out with young people, maybe you know how addicted they are to TikTok, how Snapchat has taken over their lives, and the ways that they're trafficking images of themselves are not even images of their true selves. It's a very unfortunate development for many of them. But here's sort of the good news, and I love this slide because some of us may be cool, but we'll never be John Paul II rocking Chuck Taylors on a camping trip cool. And so you have some of these pictures of the young Father Karol Wojtyła. And in COVID times, some of this can happen and beyond, but the vision, the dream behind the resources that you see in front of you and beyond ministry is this word, the shore de visco. So young people who hung out with a young Father Karol Wojtyła back before youth ministry was quite as formalized, and behind the walls of the Iron Curtain, in a time where a lot of the camping trips that he did were clandestine, where he was literally rolled up on by the KGB and asked to show his papers. And John Paul figured out a way just very simply to engage young people's hearts, to listen and to ask questions. And I think a lot of the content of both Love and Responsibility, which is kind of the philosophical precursor to Theology of the Body and the Theology of the Body audiences, that material is not only informed by scripture and tradition and sound philosophy, but by the experience of pastoral ministry. Young people talk to a young Father Karol Wojtyła, and they describe their time with him as a safe place, as a zone of freedom, as a place where you could really be yourself, where you could ask the questions that you had without fear of reprisal or judgment, and always to know that you would be loved and challenged. And that's really what we want, not only our resources, but our ministry to do. And it's what we hope that our homes are. Gosh, I hope it's what my home is. I've got a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, and the 10-year-old is reaching some markers where, like, he's got to wear deodorant, y'all. So all of a sudden, that's just this wake up. I'm like, adolescence is coming. And it's not just a time to have a talk. It's a time for formation. And we as ministers of the church can help equip parents for that work of creating that safe environment in their home. And we can do it even on Zoom calls. I don't know, we can talk about this later, but sometimes the Zoom youth ministry meeting or the Zoom formation meeting, you're looking at like kids ceiling fans and stuff. Other times, young people will really engage in some of these calls. And maybe you've had some of those where you're like, man, how is the small group going to go? And sometimes that shore de visco can even happen digitally. Yes, a lot of scary things can happen online, but Pope Benedict talked about how the internet is a digital continent. And if our teens are on the digital continent, if our middle schoolers are on the digital continent, then so must we be. With all of the proper safe environment protocols that your diocese prescribes, maybe with parents in the room on the Zoom call, especially with middle schoolers that we're talking about these things. But I think that safe environment, that zone of freedom, it can happen. What does it look like? Well, it's prayerful. And we began with prayer. Thank you to our seminarian friend for beginning us with that prayer to root ourselves in what we're really about. There is method and content, and I can talk about how the resources help us with that method and content. Teaching methods, being prepared, building that foundation, having a quick response on sensitive topics. And I'll share with you some documents we put out there that often you want to talk about lesson 101, and all of a sudden, if you're doing a good job, they want to talk about the most controversial thing that they can possibly think of. And not just sort of ducking the question is important, but also not allowing the whole lesson to be hijacked by the question. So having some quick responses is helpful, as I'm sure Father Karol Wojtyła did, and as I'm sure a lot of us do, and hopefully we can help to even refine some of those. And just having an interdisciplinary awareness, knowing what our young people are learning in school, knowing the kinds of, as young Father Karol Wojtyła did, knowing the ideologies that are out there that are shaping young people's minds and hearts. I will say, and I think this is, it's safe to say, and TikTok is an indoctrination machine, that a lot of the social media that our young people are getting are implanting ideas and ideologies that they never learned in a classroom, but that were just sort of implanted by these quick 20-second videos on a feed. And being aware of that is important, as well as being aware of, the actual academic things that our young people are being taught. We want to set a tone. The Socratic method, asking questions and actually waiting for answers, is important. Being able to think, pair, and share. I know during COVID, actually, a lot of things on this list may be a little more difficult to do. If you're trying to keep young people 6 feet apart and having them think, pair, and share, that may be a little difficult. But Zoom has tools for this as well. Being able to kind of go around the room, being aware of pop culture and what's going on for good and for ill, and not always to beat up on pop culture, to affirm what's good. It's not always like beating up on like, well, here's this song and it's really popular and it's really gross. It's hey, here's this song and it's really popular and here are echoes of the gospel. It's got to be both. Being able to stay on task, and of course to pray at all times, for us to be rooted in prayer. Here's a little bit of what the theology of the body is. Okay, so you could think about the following analogy. Let's say that you walk into a movie or you tune into a movie and you're 20 minutes late. Where you pretty much end up is just the heart of the struggle. And you might be a little confused because you never were really introduced to the characters. You're just introduced to kind of the mess that's happening in the plot. And let's say that you had to leave 20 minutes early. Well, you'd get introduced to the mess of the plot and some sort of pursuit to resolve it without really knowing who the characters are and how they got that way, and without knowing how it ended up. And welcome to life after Genesis chapter 3. That we live in the middle of this epic story and this epic drama. And for all of us who live a human life, to quote the great American poet Billy Joel, we didn't start the fire. It was always burning since the world was turning. And you were born into a world where already all kinds of things were happening with regard to your family history, with regard to geopolitical history, and the mess of history had already sort of happened. And let's say that we die before the second coming. Without recourse to our faith, life could seem pretty meaningless. And a lot of the honest atheist professors or philosophers of the 20th century and of the 21st century, as are writing now, will rightly ask the question, well, what's the point of it all? And if you think about the experience of many of our teens, it's to try to make sense, especially in the middle of this pandemic, to make sense out of what life is. Well, what the theology of the body is a look at our human story. It is more than anything, and what John Paul II called an adequate anthropology, a way to understand the meaning of our humanity. And we could look at it in 3 acts. We could say that our life as a church, and your life and my life, it is an epic love story. And it begins with being created in the image and likeness of God. It begins with our first parents who were naked and without shame, who could gaze upon one another and love and self-gift and experience the love of God the Father and reflect that love on one another. And that was really awesome. And it lasts all of 1 chapter of Scripture. We get 1 chapter of that, and then enters temptation, and then enters sin and suffering and death. And things escalate quickly because by Genesis 4, brother is killing brother. And we're a couple of chapters into Genesis and there's a great flood because things are just so out of control. But the one blessing that the flood does not destroy is the family, is the hope that could be restored in the image that we find in man and woman. You see, our God is not an old guy in the clouds with a beard who got bored and made people. Our God is an eternal exchange of love. And that eternal exchange of love makes creatures in his image and likeness. And yes, Adam alone is in the image and likeness of God. And yes, Eve alone is in the image and likeness of God. But the image and likeness of God is found in community of persons, in communion of persons, so that our first parents, Adam and Eve, in the one flesh union, in the way that they entered into the covenant of marriage, in their sexual relationship, literally, they express something in the image and likeness of God in the way that they freely, totally, faithfully, and fruitfully express love, in the way that they open themselves to new life. And that's all really beautiful. And yet our experience of sexuality after the fall doesn't always read like that. It reads like conflict and suspicion. It reads like, I see you seeing me, and I want you to see me the way that I want to be seen, but I don't want you to define me. And that's all, actually, that's Jean-Paul Sartre. He's describing how messed up love relationships can be. And there's all this drama, but in the middle of it, this is the good news, Jesus enters into the story. And whereas we'd seen so much dysfunction, we saw even, Solomon taking like 1,000 wives, and we see, like actual misogyny in the Old Testament. We see all this like messed up stuff. We see in Jesus a bridegroom who lays down his life for the bride. We see a hope of a restoration. We see a new covenant. We see Jesus saying from the beginning, and this is where John Paul II picks up in the theology of the body and causes us to reflect back on our origins. He says, from the beginning, it was not so. It wasn't like this. For this reason, a man leaves his father and his mother, and he clings to his wife, and the two become one flesh. We hear St. Paul trying to explain to us what marriage is like. And he says, husbands, lay down your lives. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. We see that image, that icon of a bride and a bridegroom. And still, here we are in 2020. And it doesn't always look like, but that sacraments are our hope. That marriage, as John Paul II says, is the least inadequate analogy for how it ought to be, for the love of Christ and the church, for the love of the Trinity. And our hope is that all of this is really leading us to heaven. And that all of our experiences, but most especially the experience of love and marriage and family, is an icon that leads us and should lead us to heaven, to what we're destined for. And we forget our story. We have this radical forgetting, and then also we have this radical remembering. And I hope, as every time I talk about this, you can probably, I'm just on a Zoom call, but I get really excited because I'm like, this is actually what's going on. Every morning I get out of bed and, there's whatever going on. There's like trying to get out of the door, and there's like my son, like, I don't know, like throwing his shoes or something because he's 10 and just has a lot of energy, and there's all of the scramble. But whenever I remember, I don't know about you, but it's exciting to remember who we really are and what this story is really all about. And to bring that message to our teens and to their parents is really exciting too. And that remembering, it leads to trust, it leads to communion, it leads to worship, it leads to gratitude, which is something that we all need. John Paul II says this word chastity needs to be rehabilitated. There are a lot of Catholic words that need some rehabilitation. There are words that when teenagers hear it, or when you and I hear it, they sound kind of boring and stale and stuffy. When I say like, hey, everybody, we're going to go to a chastity workshop. It's not like we would be lining up to be like, woo, we might be with Augustine and say like, give me chastity, but not right now, right? But the word actually means something really positive. It means the freedom to love powerfully. And so chastity has to be rehabilitated. The word like virtue also is a word. If we're going to talk about the virtues, everyone's kind of like, meh. But virtue is the excellence of our humanity. It's being able to be free to be who I really am. Vocation is a word that sounds like, they're going to like try to whisk me away to, there's a bus out back, and there's like a bunch of habits and collars, and they're going to like get me on that bus. And before you know it, I'll be like, wait, how have I been ordained 20 years or something like that? But really vocation is a vocation to priesthood. It is a vocation to religious life, but it's also a vocation to marriage. And it's also discovering for our single brothers and sisters that there's a vocation to be found. And I call that, it's not a word from John Paul, but this is my own kind of, I like to say it's kind of a pilgrim vocation, and that the single person is a sign of the church, which is the boat of salvation making its way toward heaven. For our single brothers and sisters who may be on this call, that icon fits in very beautifully to this whole story. So chastity frees us from a utilitarian attitude, which is a fancy way of saying it frees us from using people. And using people is in everything from sexuality to economy is kind of the problem, right? That people are not commodities. Every person you encounter is a person to be loved, never a thing to be used, whether on a screen, whether person to person, or even in an exchange of business. Like even people you do business with are people. It's immortals that we bank with, right? It's those who are destined for glory. And John Paul wants us to take a look at that. And I think chastity is the virtue that can really unlock that. He says it's a sure way to happiness and love and responsibility because it frees us to love. It's a yes to love. Chastity is not a no, it is a yes. And when I make that yes to love and I make a yes to those demands, then as a result, I'll be able to say no to other things that are incompatible. Just like somebody who's serious about being a championship athlete says yes to getting up early and being the first one to show up at practice, and therefore says no to other things that conflict with that goal. So it is a gift of self. And hopefully this is, I think probably for a lot of us on the call, this is obvious stuff. I don't know about you, but it's good to be reminded. And abstinence is related to chastity, but you could be abstinent and not chaste. You could say like, well, technically, I'm not having sex before I'm married. Or you could even say like, technically I'm not falling into sin X, Y, and Z. But just because you're saying no doesn't mean you're saying yes. You could be saying no, you could be abstinent, and you could be a rubber band that's being pulled tighter and tighter and tighter until it pops, right? We don't want that for our teens. We don't want it for young people. We don't want it for people in marriages, for people in seminaries, for people in religious communities. We want our sexuality to be at the service of a gift of self, whether in celibacy or marriage or wherever it is. So here's a little bit of a breakdown of the audiences of theology of the body. I shared these slides, and I think you'll probably get them in an email if you want to, if this will be helpful to you. But this is kind of like and I'll give credit to Brian Butler who put this slide together. And it just kind of is a breakdown. So the first part of theology of the body, establishing that vision of humanity, is to look at how it was in the beginning, and then to look at our human experience now in light of Jesus Christ at the center of human history, and then to look at where we're headed, to look at heaven. And I think that's where a lot of the good news of the theology of the body comes in. There's also, we could say, this, I think kind of an important understanding. And this slide kind of, for those of you who study a little psychology, it harkens to what Freud gets and what Freud misses. So Sigmund Freud, kind of the father of modern psychology, he would say that below the surface we have this sexual desire. He would call it your id, right? And he would say this is the lowest sort of common denominator, and really we can repress, and if we repress, then eventually we might indulge, and if we indulge, we might do so in unhealthy ways. Things come out sideways. And Freud would say maybe the best we can do is figure out how to indulge in a way that doesn't hurt people. John Paul says it's not quite that. He's like, Freud, you're onto something, but you're missing something. John Paul would say that our sexual desires, your sexual desires, my sexual desires, our whole makeup, our whole biological reality is the physical manifestation of something that's a layer deeper. And that is our drive for communion. You see, it's not just fulfilling sexual desire that fulfills people, because people who just constantly gratify themselves sexually find themselves in a law of diminishing returns, therefore doing more and more things to gratify themselves, and therefore finding themselves more and more empty. It's a quest to being Gollum, right? That's not real satisfaction. You see, our sexual desire is supposed to be put at the service of our drive for communion. And when it is, when we realize that my sexual yeses and nos can express communion with God and the right kind of communion with other people, then we move toward redemption. We experience pain because of that. Saying the right yeses and nos to sex will result in some human suffering and difficulty, but a fulfilling kind, and the kind that draws us closer and closer to the love that we were all created for, the love of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. If you've ever read The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis, there are all these people who are on their way to heaven, but they're kind of stuck in purgatory. And it's a very imaginative book, and in some ways a weird book, but one of my favorite books. But we encounter this soul that's in purgatory. We'll say it's purgatory. He doesn't call it that in the book, but that's what he's getting at. And there's this soul, and he's got a little lizard on his shoulder, and the lizard is just like whispering, whispering, whispering. And this giant angel with a flaming sword comes up to him and says, "Can I cut that off?" Now, spoiler alert, the lizard is lust. The lizard is sexual desire that's not put at the service of communion or love. The lizard is lust apart from love. It's self-assertion apart from self-gift. And his whole life, it's just been like kind of whispering in his ear, and it's keeping him back. And the man says, to the angel, what are you going to do with that sword? And he says, can I cut that off? Will you be willing to be separated from lust? And the man is like, will it hurt? And the angel says, yes, it's going to hurt. And what eventually happens is that the lizard is cut off, but where it stands fallen on the ground, there emerges a giant stallion. And the man mounts the stallion and rides it into heaven. And in the Great Divorce, the narrator's trying to figure out, like, what did I just see? What did I just look at? Well, what he looked at was lust being transformed into love. And that's what we were made for, is to be able to find those desires transformed and to begin the seeds of that for our teens and their formation. The next part of theology of the body, I'm going to start going fast here a little bit, and we can go back in questions. So I want to make sure we have at least a solid 20-something minutes. There is first a discussion of why celibacy makes sense, of why religious vocations make sense. It's the first thing that he really does. And he talks about the icon of Christ in the church. And then in light of that, there's a discussion of marriage. And then finally, at the end, is kind of the tough topic section where he talks about Humanae Vitae. Some would say, well, like the whole thing of theology of the body, all 129 Wednesday audiences are really to help us understand in some way, shape, or form why the church opposes contraception. And in the process of leading up to that, he lays out this whole beautiful vision of why everything else makes sense. But he does land there with why the church would land in this place that's a lot different than even a lot of other Christians landed in terms of contraception. The church's opposition to contraception is not because we want to be more rigid or difficult. It's that we find it unhelpful to human flourishing. And he makes a good argument for that. Okay, now we get to our resources a little bit here. So two basic questions. That was a lot, and I know on a Zoom call after like being at a lot of other sessions, you're probably like, wow, that was a lot, right? But here's the two main questions. Who am I and how do I live? Right? And this is what Brian observed back in the early days when we were first developing our resources. And this is kind of the schema that brought you the resources that we have for you here today. First is the question, well, who am I? What does it mean to be human? That's really what he's asking when he goes through the story of humanity. From the beginning, it wasn't so, but here's our brokenness, and here's how all that looks, and here's where we're destined in terms of heaven. And can that start to make sense to even a middle schooler? Yes. And can it make sense to a teenager? Absolutely. And must it make sense to us? Yes. And then the question of how do I live? And that's where it moves from morality into vocation. So the framework, and I'm going to start with our middle school program. The middle school framework asks that question, who am I? And chapter 1 or session 1 is just really going through that in a way that makes sense to middle schoolers. It's getting them to think about who they are and what they like and what are the most important and formative relationships in their young life so far. And I've taught that chapter many times myself, and I find that they really engage it. There's little sections for them. It's just a section called I Answer That, which is a little bit like St. Thomas says in the Summa. But for a middle schooler, we just want their subjective opinion. We want their story. We want them to be able to start to share and talk about it. Chapter 2 is where we get into our human story, and we try to dive into Genesis in a way that would be relatable to a 6th grader, a 7th grader, an 8th grader. It begins with a story that I like to tell about a time my mom taught me a tough lesson. It was almost like a Genesis sort of story. And then chapter 3 is a beginning of a bodily expression. It's not a biology lesson, but it sets the stage for some of those conversations that parents might want to have with their middle schoolers. Then we bridge by talking about virtue. In a way that I think makes a lot of sense, that how practice leads to right action, leads to habit, leads to character, leads to destiny. And then the second part of the book is where it gets into sexuality. The original image when we were developing the resource for middle school is all of a sudden in the back of my head, I heard Karate Kid. And if you've seen Karate Kid, you remember in the beginning when it's time to teach karate, first you got to wax on, wax off, paint the fence. Well, lessons 1, 2, 3, wax on, wax off, paint the fence. Chapter 4 is where it starts to come together. And then chapter 5 is now I know karate. Now I can have a productive conversation with a middle schooler about sex and love and chastity and how to not to use and why pornography is a problem and how to spot it and look out for it. And now I can talk a little bit about what I might want to look ahead to in the future in terms of vocation. And then finally, it's just this real practical, all right, you've been through this study. What's it going to look like as a 7th grader, as an 8th grader, even as a 6th grader? And that's in a nutshell what that curriculum looks like. Now, in the perfect world, I would love for middle schoolers to go through that in 6th, 7th, or 8th grade. And then a couple years later, in a more mature way, to approach the theology of the body in the U curriculum. And in the U curriculum, we take the same track, but we go deeper in a way that's going to be relevant for teens who have a little more experience and a little more intellectual ability. So we talk about being created for love and what it is to be naked and without shame. We define love. And then we talk about hope and redemption in Christ, recognizing that many teens already have some brokenness in their stories. Some of them have had sexual encounters that they already identify as wounded, as hurtful. Some of them have addictions to pornography that they already know are problems. They're already the addict who knows, I don't want to do this anymore, and I'll stop for a couple of days, and then I find myself sucked right back in. And so there's a lot of shame there. And this is to introduce just the core of the gospel, the Jesus who came to liberate and to heal and to free. And I found some just really powerful things happen with that chapter. I recommend, if possible, if you're teaching it in person and you have clergy to hear the sacrament of reconciliation, that's one of the chapters you want to have some purple stoles ready to roll. And then the bridge here is to talk about truth and freedom. And for our older teens, we thought we needed to talk about relativism, because for a lot of them, the obstacle to talking about chastity is they think, well, what's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. And we have Father Josh Johnson doing a really great job in this session of, in a pastoral way, talking about why relativism is not liberating. And that's kind of at the heart of that chapter. And then we talk about those 4 words that you've heard me say a bunch of times in this presentation: free, total, faithful, fruitful. Jesus on the cross, he gives himself freely. He gives himself totally to us. He is faithful even when we're not faithful. And the fruit of it, the blood and the water that flows out from his side, is the life of the church. And so every sexual encounter should be that. And we talk about what that's going to look like. And then there's more on the language of the body, which gets into different issues of sexuality, including pornography and practical questions like how far is too far, and those kinds of things. And then there is a section on marriage, and then on priesthood, consecrated life, and celibacy. Because the, again, not so secret, not so hidden, not so evil plan is that theology of the body formation should be pointing toward vocation. Just like in confirmation preparation, you have candidates that show up and they're like, well, I want to do this so I can get married in the church someday. You want to say, well, that's not entirely why, but you know what? That reason it's not totally off, because you are receiving the Holy Spirit into your heart. So you will be equipped for a vocation later. It's not just to tick off a box, but it is to equip you for vocation. And then we have one that's just like the other one, a practical chapter on friendship, dating, and family. And there is an extended appendix, which was material from the old theology of the body for teens that we didn't want to lose, but we didn't want it to be a whole session. So we wrote it into an appendix, which is called Dating, Purpose, and Purity, and kind of gets into topics of dating. So that's kind of what's there. We all need love. We search for it. Teens are searching as hard as anyone. They become frustrated, disillusioned, confused. Many teens know that they're not created to be alone. And gosh, especially now, they so desperately want communion that they'll fall for whatever seems to promise it, whether it's continuing the Snapchat streak, whether it's becoming TikTok famous, or unfortunately, whether it's sending these images to this guy on the other end of the screen who's paying attention to me so that he keeps paying attention, or if it's going too far, whatever it is, because it seems to promise communion, and dissolution follows. And then as a campus minister in all girls school, I hear constantly, there's no good guys out there. And I'm like, well, time out. Like, if we want there to be good guys out there, well, when my girls are here, they can form that sisterhood, and they come here to meet their bridesmaids and not the groom. Maybe they'll meet their groom here, but first you have to have the good bridesmaids. But to find a spot to not just be constantly disillusioned, to find that hope is so important. They ask answers, but often they're asked in immaturity. And we've probably all heard that before. Like, they ask a question, but they're kind of asking it like the Pharisees might ask Jesus, like, is it true, good teacher? And you're like, whoa, But even when you're asked a question that way, to still answer it, and to answer it in a way that can connect. So I'm not going to go through all this. I do want to make sure I have time. These are just some slides on the sessions, and I'm not going to read them out loud, but knowing that you'll have these later, these are a little bit more in detail about what each session is. I would say after this call, I'm going to show you on our website too, but if you haven't had a chance to watch the trailer to the U program, you should. It's really powerful. It gets into, rather than leading with something about like, wait till you're married, it leads with the story of a human life. It leads with who you are and what your identity is. And it leads with that to lead to the right way to talk about all the other questions. It's really beautiful. So there are all of those. I know I'm just rocketing through, giving you whiplash. I'll take a minute to talk about Humanae Vitae, because I think it's kind of important. If you're wondering, like, where's the church getting all this? Well, quick kind of history lesson. You go back to the 1960s, there's a lot of questions. The sexual revolution is happening. And in the church, in the wake of Vatican II, people are just asking questions like, well, how do we talk about this stuff? Do we need to, quote unquote, get with the times? And Paul VI releases a document which I think he knew would go over like a lead balloon. And it's a really challenging document that preserves the church's teaching on contraception. And he also knows in an encyclical, it's not like people are usually approach Pope Francis maybe a little bit more, but most of the time people don't go home and read encyclicals, right? Now we can pull them up online, and hopefully you read the one last week, which has a lot of hope, and hopefully you read Pope Francis' encyclical on the environment and some of those things. But I think Paul VI knew in the 60s a lot of people weren't going to read this, but he makes an argument for why. For why the church continues her teaching with regard to human sexuality. He gives those words about freedom, totality, faithfulness, and fruitfulness. But he also makes some prophecies. And he says, look, if we fall more and more into a contraceptive culture where we're separating sex from love and from babies, we're separating it from its unitive and procreative dimensions, there's some things that are going to happen. And he says there's going to be a general lowering of morality. He predicted a further degradation of women. And we could look, like at modern culture, and there, for all of the things that we could say are wonderful in terms of the advancement of women, we can say that over-sexualization is not something that's gone away. And as a matter of fact, sometimes it's mistaken for empowerment. Sometimes it's a message, well, if men are going to be gross and disgusting, then so should we be. And that's unfortunate. So he talks about this way in which the image of women and the image of men would be further degraded. He talks about this attitude of super superiority that we might have over the way that we possess our bodies and the way that we look at it. He also talked about the body being treated as a commodity. And those, and another thing, it's not on the slide, but he also said that he was cautious of the way that the political entities would get on board and would use contraception for means of control of people. And so he says, here's some things that would happen. And then in the end, he says, look, this problem of the regulation of birth, of contraception, like every other problem, has to be considered beyond partial perspectives. If we want to talk about any real human problem, we got to talk about what it really means to be human. He said it had to be seen in the light of a total vision of our humanity, in our vocation, not only in its natural and earthly, but in its supernatural and its eternal vocation. So he really leaves the door open for what the theology of the body is. And he leaves the door open for what I think our task is here today. If we want to talk to young people effectively about sex, then we have to talk to them effectively about the vision of humanity. And the church has a rich teaching with this. And my only hope is that the resources that we have can be helpful for opening the door to that in a further way. So I'm going to back off from my PowerPoint because I'm conscious of time. And I'm going to share screen in a bigger way because I do want to show you our resources. So I'm going to share my whole screen. I hope I don't have a million windows open, but I might. No, I don't. I'm well behaved today. So I'm on the Ascension website, and you can see my screen still, huh? Cool. So Ascension is a company that does a lot of faith formation resources. If you're familiar with us, it may be from our Bible studies, from The Great Adventure. It may be from Father Mike and his videos. That's a way that a lot of people kind of got familiar with Ascension. It may be that the particular programs that we're here talking about are the ways that you're familiar. So we have a number of resources, and I'll talk about our study programs really quickly. And today we're talking about teen faith formation. And so that will take us to our Theology of the Body resources. We'll go to the page for you. And here you have the course. There are leaders resources, including some videos and some training resources for this and for middle school. Actually, the middle school edition, there is a formation session. Say that you're the DRE or youth minister in a parish and you have others that are working with you. I have a video where I facilitate kind of a training in theology of the body, and that's available right here, open source on the website. So when you click on leaders resources, you can see this. And there's a video for parent. There's the leadership training video. This is also myself and Mari Pablo, who are the presenters on this. And you can see there's a guide to sensitive topics, some other things. You go back over here and you can see the program itself. We always had some sort of digital option, but now we've partnered with this whole other Thinkific platform. So you could, especially during the pandemic, go with a totally digital online course where you get a subscription to the online course and the whole thing happens at home. And then there's a workbook, then there's a student pack, which would include a parent guide, which I think would be very important. It's not much more than the online course. You could get a workbook and the digital access. And then there's a starter pack, which would include also a DVD for when we can get back into our parishes and use DVDs. Then there's just a leader guide, which would come with the digital access. And you can see kind of later how all this sort of goes. In terms of Spanish language resources for the U program, we have the parent guide available in English and Spanish. And we'd like to, in the future, have, and we have been working on further translations of all of our studies. At this point, Chosen is totally bilingual if you use our confirmation resources. But the U program, as far as we've gotten so far, is to translate the parent guide, because what we've heard is that that's the most urgent need, is to have a parent resource available in English and in Spanish. But there are efforts underway for that to go further, to have a completely bilingual resource, as we do for a lot of our other studies. Our baptism study, I think that's just about to release in a bilingual format in Chosen as well. So that's a little bit on our website, and I want to open the door to any questions that you have, and I could always go back to the website if there are things that you're wondering. Oh, and in terms of, there are a ton of free resources, I should say. So you go to this Ascension Presents tab, everything from articles to podcasts to videos. If you've enjoyed this presentation, I have a library up there. My podcast kind of came in for a landing in August, but even some of our episodes are relevant to this topic. There's, I think, 120 something episodes of podcasts up there that are just quick reflections for busy Catholics that I did over the past couple of years, as well as Father Josh Johnson, Ted Sri. This is Michael Gormley or Gomer, and Dave Van Vickel, Jeff Cavins. Ascension Roundtable discontinued a few years back, but it's for ministry professionals, for people who are working in parishes and schools, as well as articles and such. So I said a lot, and we've got a little bit of time. So let's see, what are you wondering? I'm going to look at a chat over here, and
we did get a question there from Alicia. Alicia, I don't know if you can hear me, and if you'd like to ask your question out loud, just to kind of continue the dialogue. If I don't hear from you, I can also read the chat. So there's Alicia.
Sure.
We are already using theology of the body for teens for our middle school and high school, and we're using Ascension resources. Mm-hmm. I was just wondering, if we were to introduce theology of the body for parents, what would you recommend that we use under Ascension Press?
Okay, sure. So where we just were, there is a parent video, and you can share that link with parents. I would say that would probably be a good introduction. And the other thing I would say with the Thinkific platform is that all of the videos are now accessible to, say students and parents in the same home. They could access all of the videos for themselves. But I think that parent video, sending that out ahead of time would be very helpful. And we literally were having this discussion yesterday, and I'm sure a lot of you can kind of relate that you buy a parent resource and you're like, you read through it because it's your program, and you're like, well, this is really good. And you give it to a parent, and the parent like takes a look at it and they're like, thank you. And then they kind of put it in between the car seats. And then next time they detail their car in 3 years, they pull it out and they're like, oh, and they throw it away, So one thing that to take a look at, and I know this is hard, but when it's tried, it's often successful, is to facilitate some sort of group with parents. And there's a balance here where parents, if you say, well, every time that the teens are going to meet, we're going to meet, that might not happen. But even if you said, parents, we're going to meet 3 times, we're going to use the parent guide that we sent you. We're going to go over, session 1. We're going to do session 1 together. And so we're going to ask you to read up a little bit. We're going to show the parent video, and then we want to invite you into this discussion. Even if it was Zoom, you might find that it works pretty well, because gosh, like when we try to engage parents, it sometimes works so awesomely. I always kind of share this story, but I found myself after a TOB training, sitting on a plane next to a guy. I didn't feel like talking. It was a 6-hour version of this, what we're doing now. And I may have even been on my way back from the West Coast. I don't remember. But I sat down next to this guy, and he wanted to talk, and he's like, so you headed here for fun or whatever? It's pre-COVID, so nobody was wearing masks, everyone could talk. And he just started asking questions. I was like, I'll probably end this conversation by telling him what I was doing. So I was like, well, I was given a workshop. And he was like, on what? And I was like, well, sex, love, Jesus, and teenagers. And his response, I kid you not, he goes, oh, the theology of the body? And I was like, yes, so shocked that he had heard of it. But this guy's whole conversion story was basically that he went to a parent meeting that wasn't just the informational parent meeting, it was real formation. And that he and his wife, their whole family was changed as a result of this. Just somebody approaching them, and instead of just putting a book in their hand and saying like, here's the ordering form, or here's the calendar, somebody like witnessed to them, And he said that my wife and I, after this meeting, we wanted to know more. And I think in their case, they even went through like some RCIA stuff in their parish, even though they weren't coming into the church more. They were like, where's like good adult formation? So you will find that some parents are like going to keep it at an arm's length, but gosh, like if we're all things to all to save at least some, you might put a parent guide in somebody's hands, or even just host a Zoom meeting and say, hey, watch the thing that your kid watched for chapter 1 and let's talk about it. And it could be like mind-blowingly different for them. So long answer to that question.
Colin, I wanted to add one thing to that, and maybe it would be a good resource since provided by Ascension Press. Are you familiar with Dr. Popchak's book, Beyond the Birds and the Bees?
Yeah. And I think that might be
woven in, because I think that's an awesome parent resource.
It is, yeah. So it's called Beyond the Birds and Bees by both. I think both Dr. Popchak and I think both Popchaks are co-authors on that. But a comprehensive resource for parents. Also, one of the blogs that I share with you is a shorter version of that, but it's an email that my wife wrote to somebody who was asking birds and bees questions that I thought was so good. I had signed up for a blog on how to talk to your kids, and I was like, I'm just going to copy her email. So that's a shorter version. But those 3 blogs I sent might be helpful to send to parents too, as kind of quick reads, to introduce them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What other questions do we have out there? Let's see.
I think that's the only one that came up in the chat. I don't know if anyone else has something they'd like to say. You could either write in the chat, or you can also feel free to unmute yourself. We're a small enough group that I think that would work. We could manage that.
Sure.
I have a question if no one else does.
Fine. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll go then if no one else is going. Colin, do you know, would Ascension be able to provide any kind of samples to parishes that are interested? And also, if they do provide something like that, who would we contact?
So I would call customer service. I think that we still are doing, so the sales side of things is a little different during the pandemic, but I think we are still able to do like a review pack kind of thing,
Okay.
Where you, that would be, but calling our customer service number would be good. But also if you have resources, follow up questions about like, well, what about in my parish? I'd be happy to make some of those follow up calls as well with you. So if there's something specifically you were looking at, but part of the sampling of it, I think a lot of things are right there on the website where you can preview like the first chapter and kind of work through it that way. But if you wanted hard copies of the resource, I think there's still a review policy. Okay. And even if it's not advertised, if you asked, I think they probably would. Yeah.
Okay, great. Any other questions? So So everyone, Colin did send some, like, as he mentioned, the blogs. I'll be sure to send those along with the recording after the presentations. So, any other questions? We have a few more minutes of our audience here with Colin.
I have a question.
Sure.
In terms of training, does Ascension provide free trainings to
Yes.
catechists?
So what we've got right now, there is the leadership training series that's available for the middle school program and for the high school program. And those are both right there on the website. And actually, let me share a screen so you can see a little more how that works. This is something that I worked on really last fall. So we were even, before COVID, I think everyone was traveling more. But we had started to build more of an online training library even before then, which I think is fortunate, because of course now it's hard to travel places. But if you can see my screen, I'm going right now over to Teen Faith Formation. And I'm going to go to the middle school one. And for this, if you go to Leaders Resources, in terms of training, there's a leadership formation series, and it's basically 4 videos. And what we did with it was to give a download that kind of assumes that the videos would be viewed together. So you have this formation resource, and there are small group questions. So you gather your team, and hopefully in a maybe even like this, that it could certainly work over Zoom. Everyone has this. Everyone takes a minute and they watch the different sessions, and after that, there's a chance for just some real deep conversations about the theology of the body and how you're going to do it. So who are you and what inspired you to be a part of this program, which could be a really awesome discussion among volunteer catechists, among parents, among DREs, parish staff people, maybe even your pastor gets involved in that. What do you hope to learn today? And then it gets into the culture of middle school and some questions about that. When you think about your recovering middle schooler, like what are your experiences and your thoughts? A little bit of group therapy, maybe. What are you going to do to create the right kind of environment? How can we effectively engage parents and offer hope and support? And my hope on this one was that in parishes, people would listen to what I had to say, but then they would start to think about like, well, this is specifically at our parish. This is who we have. This is the space that we have. This is the calendar that we have, and this is how we want to do this. So we're gonna offer Tuesday night wine and cheese like 3 times, and we think at 6:30 p.m. we can get some parents to show up, and we know that here's like a mom and a dad that are kind of a mover and shaker, and they'll get texting, they'll get on their phones, they'll get everybody there, or I don't know, that's one specific instance. Or it might be like during COVID time, it's like, all right, well, man, we're kind of limited, but we're gonna try the 6 o'clock Zoom meeting or the 7 o'clock Zoom meeting and really invite parents to it. And then there's session 2 kind of gets into the theology of the body itself, because one of the challenges for this resource is that we want everyone who's teaching this to have a deeper background in the theology of the body itself. We've been on this call for, an hour and like 10 minutes, and I was trying to give a little bit of a crash course. I'm going to guess that some of you are like, yeah, some of you may have been to the Theology of the Body Institute. Some of you have read extensively. Others of you were like, well, I wanted to come to a chastity workshop. I'm not sure about all this. So the video there is a little deeper into what the theology of the body is. And then there's a discussion after, and then it's a closer look at the program. So that's a training resource that we offer. That's kind of like somewhere between like a webinar and a program that we're putting out there. But it's for free, and hopefully that's helpful. And it's sort of similar for the U program, but with the U program, it's more just the video, and then you can kind of come up with whatever questions you think would be helpful.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Tammy, do you have a question? Please go, feel free.
Well, it wasn't necessarily a question. I was just going to say thank you so much. We're using this, and we do a chapter a month. So we do one a month for the students and their and their parents are invited to watch on, and we're doing it through Zoom. But I'm really grateful to hear about that leadership part. I hadn't noticed that. So thank you so much for sharing that. Perfect. We'll do that right away.
Okay, thank you. Awesome. I'm really glad that you're doing that. And to all of you who are on the call, a big, just a big thank you for your yes, to continue to do ministry, especially in this area, is really challenging. I mean, it was challenging in 2019, but right now it can be really daunting. And so I'm so edified to hear that you're posting this through Zoom. And my inner optimist in the beginning of all of this, I was like, well, maybe parents will end up being more involved, because they'll just kind of be in the room and they'll be a little more curious. Whereas before they were kind of outsourcing formation, they can't do that anymore. And it's quite possible that parents become more engaged and maybe experience some hope and healing themselves, so awesome. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing.
Wonderful. Well, again, Colin, thank you so much. And I don't think there's any more questions. If there are, please speak now or forever, at least for a little while, hold your peace. Colin, just know that we'll pray for you and your ministry there at your school and your family and everyone, and hope you survive safely through COVID and hurricane season there in Louisiana. And know that we'll hold your ministry and Ascension Press in our prayers, and we ask you to do the same for all of us. And, like I mentioned, I know it's a busy time, so we're really thankful that we can put this as a recording for our DCMs, our directors of catechetical ministry, and our other leadership and principals to review it at another time. So we're very thankful. So we'll be sure to share also the resources that you sent me in email, okay? So why don't we close in a quick prayer together? We'll place ourselves under our dear mother's care as we pray together. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so thank you so much, Colin. Take care. God bless you, and thank you everyone for being with us all the way to the bitter end. And now go enjoy a beautiful lunch.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.